Hello class, and welcome to your Chapter 2 lecture where we're going to discuss the extent and nature of juvenile crime. Our learning objectives for this lesson, that by the end you should be able to summarize juvenile crime trends and how the data is categorized, measured, and reported, describe the methods, benefits, and limitations of self-reporting, describe the context of juvenile victimization, and describe the dimensions of law-violating behavior. So let's start out with talking about the major data sources that we have in delinquency. So the UCR collects information from the FBI. It's our official crime statistics since the 1930s, and it's the primary source of knowledge that we have of all of this crime reporting. Police departments across the nation report data. Unfortunately, it does underestimate crime because, as we know, not all crime gets reported. So Part 1 offenses are offenses such as murder, rape, aggravated assault, robbery, and burglary. These are your very serious offenses. Your Part 2 are things like simple assault, buying, receiving, and possession of stolen property, or carrying weapons and fraud. So this provides data on the age, sex, and race of the offender, as well as the amount of crime that they commit. It's also going to show us whether crime is increasing or decreasing, and the amount of crime by city, gender, and race of the offender. So then we also have juvenile court statistics. Juvenile court statistics show us what happens to juveniles who come to the attention of authorities, whether that be the police or the courts. And most youth are going to come to court attention by the police filing a petition or formal complaint. We also have self-report studies, which have been used since the 1940s to measure hidden youth crime, because again, not all crime is reported. So large amounts of hidden delinquency occur and just is not ever reported to the police. And victimization surveys are also used here, which focus on the hidden or non-reported crimes as well. So self-report studies are going to be individuals self-reporting on crime that they've committed, whereas victimization surveys report from the victim's standpoint if they've been affected by crime. When we're talking about collecting data and analyzing data, we have to consider the reliability and validity of these tools. So reliability measures consistency, and this is when a researcher can produce the same results using the same instrument time after time. Then we know that that tool, that survey, is reliable. Validity tells us, are researchers actually studying what they believe they're actually studying? So it's important to know the distinction between those two as well when we're considering surveys and different types of studies that are conducted on juvenile crime. Now, looking at the context of juvenile victimization, we see this in a few different areas. So you see it in the family, the school, we see it in mass shootings and bullying, and even child prostitution. So younger children are actually the largest percentage of victims of maltreatment, and over 28% of all victims of maltreatment were younger than 3 years of age, with the highest being for those under 1. Unfortunately, majority are from neglect. Then under that, we see physical abuse, sexual abuse, and sex trafficking. When we talk about schools, we see crime in schools rising and being worse than it used to be. We've gone from sort of running the halls and maybe some graffiti and leaving class to now we see drugs and alcohol in our schools. We see assaults occurring. It is interesting to know that males and females are victims equally, and that suburban schools actually have the highest rate of victimizations of any schools. You can take some guesses as to why that may be. Mass shootings are also on the rise, even though they're still rare events that occur. About 24 of these actually occur each year in the US. And most of the individuals who engage in a mass shooting, their intentions have been leaked either on social media or to friends, and that's how it's found out that that's what they're intending. The majority of people do support having armed resource officers within the schools, though a lesser percentage tend to agree with arming teachers and staff. We know bullying has been an issue, not just in schools, but everywhere, especially with social media. So traditionally, this would have been face to face, direct, where someone's either hitting, pushing another person, or verbal and consistent teasing about the way they look, their family, what they wear. Maybe it's emotional bullying. So they're just trying to generate fear and distress in another person. But unfortunately, with the advent of the internet, this now occurs through cyberbullying. So where you used to be able to escape that when you got home, now it continues. And I can say from personal experience, when I was in middle school, I guess middle school leading a little bit into high school, I was bullied extensively by other girls in the school for a variety of reasons. It was not just emotional, it was not just verbal, but at one point it did turn into some face-to-face direct in the school. And unfortunately, I would go home, and if anyone's familiar with AIM still, Instant Messenger, essentially I would come home to these instant messages, continuing that verbal and emotional abuse through these IMs. And it does impact a person. It impacts you, again, not just from the individual being in school or being direct face-to-face having to deal with that, but then the child comes home and still has to face that, which is why we've seen even juvenile suicide rising. And the last one to talk about are child prostitution. Really, juveniles who engage in prostitution, they're picked up on the streets, they're picked up at malls and even in their own yards, or this is even individuals being smuggled in from other countries through human trafficking. 90% of individuals that are brought into the US are females, and 10% are males. What's sad is that the average age is 13 for a girl to become involved in prostitution. And we'll watch a video at one point of, is prostitution actually a choice? And it'll sort of open your mind up to, does one really choose to engage in that behavior? Or is it a confluence of environmental factors, of victimization that they experienced and being sort of pushed into that life? Now, looking at some other dimensions of law-violating behavior, we're going to start off with the life course perspective, which focuses on how specific life events unravel over time, and that ultimately shapes a person's behavior over an extended length of time. So developmental life course theory says that human development and aging are lifelong processes, and that people are rational actors making these choices as they go through life. Of course, there's other factors that impact why one makes a decision or doesn't, but that's what that theory says. You then have age of onset, which refers to the age juvenile begins engaging in law-violating behavior. And we do know that the earlier a juvenile begins breaking the law, the more likely they are to continue that. A study found that having a first conviction at the age of 10, those individuals offended at a higher rate and for a longer period of time. Considering escalation of behavior, this is an increase in the number of crimes that are committed by a juvenile. And we know that the incidence of arrest actually increases at 13 years of age and then peaks at about 17 years of age. So really that age between 13 and 17 is where we see most of the juveniles who are involved in the delinquency system. Specialization of offenses refers to simply just the tendency to repeat one type of crime. But we know that with juveniles, we actually see little or no specialization of offending. This is more likely to be seen among status offenders. So again, from chapter 1, there's individuals who are underage drinking, truant, things like that. And then desistance from crime is now referring to the age where a juvenile stops engaging in delinquent behaviors. So it suggests that an individual will start to pursue a conventional lifestyle when they've dealt with the undesirabilities of continuing in that unlawful activity or those unlawful behaviors. They sort of just mature out. Or that people will continuously weigh the costs and benefits to either continuing in that criminal offending or desisting from crime, and that they will eventually stop when the costs start to outweigh the benefits that they're getting. And then we have the issue of transitioning into adult crime. So we have three groups of offenders. You have your individuals who offend only in adolescence, those who offend only as adults, or those who offend in adolescence and continue on into adulthood. So there's a higher propensity to offend when it's related to poor parental supervision, when there's parental rejection involved, or the parents are also involved in criminality, when they have siblings who are delinquent, or when their IQ is lower. We tend to see a higher propensity toward delinquency for those individuals. The chronic offender now, also known as the serious delinquent or career criminal, is really characterized by somebody who has a commitment to and involvement in continuing crime. Usually they commit serious crimes against either person or property. And we talk about some of the characteristics. They come from lower class backgrounds. They have insufficient parental support. They have a history of failing in social institutions such as school. And they drop out of school. And typically then that's followed by a pattern of unemployment. So we know that non-criminal and situational offenders tend to move from this causal involvement with other offenders on the street to then being processed with them through the system. And then they just start to see crime as simply a way of life. And then finally, that becomes so ingrained in them that they're now willing to stand up for their involvement in criminal offending and continue to defend why they engage in those behaviors. Or we have those who grow up in low socioeconomic or impoverished areas. They're just really surrounded by crime, and they become involved at an early age, and they're with these, they're living or come from more impoverished families. They're typically the two routes that we see juveniles become chronic offender through. And now considering juvenile justice and sort of social policy. So, we collect all this information about juveniles, all this data about crime. We just talked about the different dimensions of types of law-violating behavior that we see among youth and chronic offenders. So sort of, what do we do about that? Well, we saw, a resurgence in gun crime among youth, and we saw older adults recruiting juveniles to help them steal guns, commit robberies and burglaries. We've seen big gun rings, especially with gangs. So when we really saw this sort of peak in youth violence in the mid 1980s and 1990s, homicide rates were tripling because of gun assaults. So really the police stepped in and played a major role in having this decline of gun use by juveniles, using the Boston Gun Project's Operation Ceasefire. And the two main elements to that was law enforcement's attack on firearms traffickers that were supplying these guns to juveniles, and then really just generating a strong deterrent to gang violence through a number of methods. And then we actually had the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention that implemented a partnership to reduce juvenile gun violence pilot program to, again, just really attack this issue of gun violence because it was leading to such an increase in homicide and just other violent crime among youth. And it was also around this time that we then saw an increase in juvenile transfer laws or transfer eligibility, where juveniles were being sentenced and being pushed more into the adult criminal system for these different types of offenses, which we'll talk about in a later chapter. So in sum, the UCR, juvenile court statistics, the National Crime Victimization data, and self-report surveys are really major sources of where we get our data on juvenile crime. In self-report studies, juveniles are going to tell us about the offenses that they previously committed, so we're getting the benefit of a more complete picture of the total amount of juvenile crime. Though these are limited in validity and reliability because we can't prove whether or not the juvenile is telling the truth. And victimization can take many forms for children, occurring both at home, school, and on the street. Some of the most important factors in really understanding the variables and patterns of offending are considering the life course perspective, the age of onset, how one escalates in offending or specializes in offending, understanding when and how one desists from crime, and understanding what the transition into adult crime for juveniles typically looks like. So this was your Chapter 2 lecture on the extent and nature of juvenile crime. And I hope everyone has just a wonderful week.